In the year 1981, 8 years after the Yom Kippur War, Rav Aharon Lichtenstein, Zichrono Livracha, published an article in Tradition on the ideology of Hesder. And I believe that this essay, although it's some 35 years old, I mean, it's a long time since 1981, but yet I think it's still fresh and very comprehensive, addressing many of the issues that we mentioned last week about exemption for Talmud Torah, what's called Toroso Umnasa. Now, you can read this article on your own, your essay on your own, you have it in a group, but I think I want to discuss it with you, first highlighting some points. Rav Lichtenstein is not known for being short and brief. I remember when he spoke at my father's shloshim, he spoke for almost an hour, So it's tedious work to go through this essay. You get the impression when you read it, the English is so eloquent and sophisticated that maybe it was written by someone who had a PhD from Harvard in English literature. And the truth is, in certain cases, I needed a dictionary to look up some of his words. But I think I have a few, let's call it diukim or ha'aros, some very important points that I think are not in the essay that should be brought to the fore when we analyze Rav Lichtenstein's presentation. So that's my goal, to highlight what he has to say. He points out at the very beginning that there doesn't seem to be any necessity in the years following the Yom Kippur War to present the Hesder ideology, because everyone appreciated the contribution of the Hesderniks in the Yom Kippur War. In fact, when the Syrians surprised us, the first major attack was against the Plugav Hesdernikim. I mean, tragically, only one chayal from the entire Pluga of Shiryon survived after 11 months in a chemical bath. His body was mostly burnt up. But Rav Lichtenstein points out that even the military appreciates the contribution of the Hesdernikim. And therefore, he says, why, he questions himself, why write this essay and present the ideology of Hesder when it's so respected and appreciated? No one questions the contribution of the Hesderniks. But he says the following, that time has passed since the Yom Kippur War, and in a sense, both polar extremes, which I'll explain, have gotten stronger and stronger. Voices in the military, in the Ministry of Defense, are calling for yeshiva students to put in a full 3 years of army duty. And on the other polar extreme, the Rosh Yeshiva are pressing for what we called Toros Umnasa. And therefore, Rav Lichtenstein feels that there is a necessity, since 8 years have gone by since the Yom Kippur War, to try to present in a cogent fashion the philosophy behind Hesder. he points out, and if you want to look at the pages, which I would surely encourage you to do, on page 200, that your typical graduate of yeshiva high school in Israel has three options. He can either choose 3 years of army duty, sadir, or he can choose Toroso Noso, to go from a yeshiva high school to a full-time yeshiva program and at least defer his army duty. And the middle of the road, which one could ostensibly argue is a compromise, is the option of Hesder. And Rav Lichtenstein begins his analysis with a translation of the word Hesder. He offers the word arrangement, picturing a debate, so to speak, a tug of war between the Ministry of Defense on the one hand and the Rosh Yeshiva on the other hand. And let's come up with an arrangement, a kind of a compromise between both polar extremes. And from this perspective, Hesder is more of a pragmatic solution to a very intense problem than an ideology, than an ideal. It's just an arrangement. And he goes on to say that it's a very comfortable kind of an arrangement. It sort of like solves your conscience. It quiets down your matzpun, because on the one hand, you want a serious yeshiva program, and on the other hand, you want to give and contribute to the defense of the country. So we have here a very fine compromise that'll make us feel very good about it. And in that sense, hip, hip, hooray for this arrangement, for this compromise. And therefore, he says on both a psychological and a moral level, this compromise seems to be a very attractive option for the graduates of yeshivot tichoniot, because you are giving due to both. Now, we have to turn the clock back to the year 1981 to understand what Hesder looked like in that period of time. It meant the following: that after you graduate high school, you spend a full year in the yeshiva, learning on a high level with dedication, Yom V'Layla, and then you went to the army for a period of 9 months. And during that period of time, you went through basic training, and that usually took you for 6 months. Then you'd spend 3 months protecting the country in event that war would break out and beefing up the army. You'd come back to the yeshiva after 9 months for a period of approximately a year to a year and a half of full-time learning, and then go back to the army for 6 months, following another year in the yeshiva, all told 5 years in the program, of which a little bit less than a year and a half was spent in the army. And the idea was to create and produce yeshiva students who, on the one hand, had their minds and their neshamos, their souls, deeply rooted in Torah learning, with the ability to reach heights in Torah, and at the same time to fulfill their moral and religious obligation towards tzah. And from that perspective, it's a very comfortable kind of choice. And that's the arrangement of Hesder. The entire essence of this essay is to present an entirely different view, namely that it's not comfortable, Hesder. It's what you might call a dialectic. Again, Rav Lichtenstein does not use that term, so don't blame him for that. It's Berzon who is introducing that term, which is taken from German philosophy of the 19th century. Hegel, if you heard of him, Hegel himself was standing on the shoulders of the ancient Greeks, Heraclitus. And the idea of a dialectic is the opposite of a compromise. It's the opposite of an arrangement. A dialectic means that you have two forces that are pulling in opposite directions. As Heraclitus used to use the mashal of a stream of water in which you walk against the stream. So you're moving in this direction, the water is pushing you in the other direction, and there's a friction, there's a tension. And Hegel called it thesis and antithesis. And Rav Lichtenstein's position on Hesder is that because of this thesis and antithesis, as a result of the tug of war pulling in two different directions, the final product is greater than the sum of its parts. He points out, and this you'll see on page 201, that Hesder in its finest, meaning in its ideal, seeks to develop in a Torah who are profoundly motivated by the desire to become serious Talmidei Chachamim, but at the same time, concurrently, to protect and defend their country. And therefore, it's not that we're offering them just an option or a privilege, but rather they are fulfilling their duty. And the duty here, their obligation is twofold: to this and to that, to Torah and to defend the country. And they are both obligations, and both have to be recognized. And Hesder is the integration of these two. He points out that even within the community that recognizes the state of Israel as the beginning of the redemption, even within that community, there is an objection raised against Hesder. He doesn't mention who raises this objection. If I'm reading correctly between the lines, I think he's referring to Merkaz Rav Kook. And for those of you who know, Merkaz Rav Kook is not a Hesder yeshiva. It's a yeshiva in which the students will eventually do army service, but it's a different type of army service and at a different age entirely. And their argument, as Rav Lichtenstein summarizes it, goes the following. And I'm going to say it in like a Gemara language. Bishlema, I could grant you that the yeshiva students should go through basic training. Give them 6 months in the army. But they're not obligated in the additional 9 months, 3 plus 6, because at that point, it's all a matter of defending the country just in case. And right now, there's no war breaking out. So to prepare our yeshiva students for battle in war, an event of war, it's enough that they undergo 6 months of basic training, which will give them all the skills and all the abilities that they need to fight in an event that war breaks out. But why add another close to a year in the army? And Rav Lichtenstein spends a lot of time, although he does admit that it's a powerful argument, but he nevertheless spends a lot of time trying to present the antithesis to that presentation. Now, in terms of the defense ministry and its appreciation or recognition for the contribution of Hesder, Rav Lichtenstein makes a fascinating point, and he puts it in his historical perspective, and apparently it's true even today. There are the older officers and the younger officers. The gripes, or shall we say complaints about Hesder, come from the younger officers. Whereas the older officers who are more mature, they see the picture in its totality. And here Rav Lichtenstein says something amazing. These officers appreciate Hesder because of the unique contribution that they make to the morale and the stamina of Tzahal. True, they don't do 3 years of army service, but at the same time, and only the older officers seem to appreciate this. The younger officers are clamoring, these guys, they don't do enough army service. We need a 3-year sadir. But the older officers appreciate that because these young men are connected to spiritual and moral strong learning and studying, they are so inspiring. Now, I was fascinated by the choice of the word inspiring. And you'll see this on page 202. He says the higher level commanders, more keenly aware of the total picture and the longer term, recognize the value of the spiritual aspect of Hesder as inspirationally significant. Now, you and I know, and we see it today, what is it, day 86, day 87, whatever it is, since October 7th, we see to what extent inspiration is significant. And Baruch Hashem, again, I don't know where this is going today. I don't know, maybe you guys can tell me because I'm very curious. But what I do know is the Am Yisrael Chai and the Yachad Nenatzech and so forth and so on, all that inspiration is playing a major role and a ripple effect throughout the Chayalim in Tzahal today. And I have no doubt in my mind that Rav Lichtenstein, if he were alive today, speaking to some of the higher officers that are running the show here in this war, would certainly support his position that the higher ranking officers appreciate the inspiration of the Hesdeniks. And I would like to add a little comment of my own. This analysis of Rav Lichtenstein should be taught to the Hesderniks as a moral obligation, a responsibility on their shoulders, which I'm not sure that every Hesdernik appreciates. Again, I taught in Hesder for 13 years. I'm not sure that every last Hesdernik appreciates the special responsibility that he has to inspire other Chayalim. And that's something that I think, just adding this as a footnote, should be emphasized time and time again. He says the junior officers, however, are concerned with keeping good soldiers in their units, and they complain about what they regard as inequity, meaning they're not doing the full 3 years. And you can't produce the best soldiers if they're doing, a half a year here and 9 months here and total of a year and a half. Says Rav Lichtenstein that we have to lay down a number of principles. And the first is that graduates of yeshivot tichoniot at the ripe old age, or shall we say the young, sensitive age of 17 and 18, must be rooted in a society, in an environment that's primarily Torah-oriented, that sees the Torah as preeminent in their lives, both from a halachic perspective and in terms of moral judgment. Because a young man at that age, for his personal spiritual development, it is absolutely critical that he find himself connected to a spiritually committed environment and one of moral leadership. Now, again, Rav Lichtenstein uses two different words here over and over again, almost like a tzemed milim. He speaks about religious commitment and at the same time moral commitment. Now, I'm not sure what he means by that. I would have loved to have asked him this question. I mean, morality is based on halakha, based on our spiritual commitment to live up to Torah demands. So I don't know exactly why he has to emphasize morality, but I think perhaps he's trying to connect the chayal who is religious with the chayal who's not religious. And what the religious chayal is going to offer as a contribution to the non-religious chayal is a moral strength, a moral fiber, moral judgment based on the Torah. Now, point number 2. At the same time that it's critical that a young man at the age of 18 in our contemporary society be connected profoundly to a Torah environment, we nevertheless have to affirm the greatest commitment of chesed that's possible. Chesed goes up and up in many levels, barbei dargot. The greatest level of chesed is to save a Jewish life. And what that means is, and it's interesting that he speaks about the state of Israel with 3 million inhabitants. Today, I think we have 3 times that number. And he says, we are out there to protect 3 million lives. And this is amongst the greatest halachic mitzvos, obligations that we have to save Jewish lives. And therefore, he comes to the following conclusion: yeshiva students are obligated to participate in the defense of the state of Israel. But he says that part of that responsibility and obligation is not just training, but rather becoming part of the reserves. And he says that the need for becoming part of the reserves is because even during peacetime, the enemies have to see an army. And that is a deterrent. He speaks about the fact that Hesderniks in his day can account for 400 tanks. You remember that Hesder in its original Gilgul, how do you say it in English? You know, its original form was totally focused on tank corps. And all the Hesderniks went into the tanks. I mean, that changed after the war in Lebanon. 400 tanks. He says that's no small accomplishment or contribution. The boys are contributing. Now, why do we need to have the Hesderniks in the Miluim situation when right now there's no immediate danger? But he says that during peacetime, we need an army to be there as a deterrent. You can't just snap your fingers and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you have an army. But here at this juncture, he raises a very, very profound point. Who's going to be there in the Israeli army if the yeshiva students don't participate? Basically, what you're doing is you're making a decision that others should fill in for you. Because if you're not going to be there, then we have to find someone else who will be there to create a defensive army. And he says that some argue that we can apply the principle of Efshal L'Kaim Al Yedei Acherim, we have a principle that a osik v'mitzvah potum a mitzvah. So the yeshiva student could claim, well, I'm learning Torah, therefore I'm potter. If there's a war or whatever training is necessary to prepare me to go out and war, okay, then for sure I have to stop my learning and undergo training, because Gadol Talmud Amevi L'Dei Maisa, we don't apply Osik Mitzvah Potter Mitzvah to Talmud Torah. But on the other hand, maybe it's Efshal L'Kaim Al Yidei Acherim. There are others who can fill in the ranks of the Miluimniks. I'll do whatever I have to do so I can absolutely serve to defend my country, protect the 3 million Jews in the country, because I'm well trained in an event of war. I know how to go out and fight. But why do I have to do the other 9 months, as we said before, in the name of the Rosh Hashiva? That's Efshal L'Kaim Al Yidei Acherim. Says Rav Lichtenstein on page 204 that it is by no means certain that I may compel others, directly or indirectly, to assume my share of a common task. He says the following, that yes, Efshal L'Kaim Al Yidei Acherim means that there's one single mitzvah that's incumbent upon someone, we don't know who that someone is, but one individual, and you know what? Somebody else could fulfill that mitzvah. But when it's a mitzvah that's incumbent on the entire tzibur, the entire society, we need every person to share in the burden. You can't say, well, let that burden be carried by someone else. And therefore it's not Efshal L'Kaim Al Yidei Acherim. Number 2, he says, the issue here is a totally different issue when we're dealing with sakonas nefashos, the possibility of danger. When we talk about the community as a whole facing a possibility of danger, an event that our enemies attack us, and we have to be there to defend ourselves against the enemy, he says, you can't say Efshal Asos Al Yidei Acherim. There's no Efshal Asos Al Yidei Acherim in a case of Pikuach Nefesh.
Sorry, when is Pikuach Nefesh? Because even the Hesder America's people, when there's war, they'll go out because they've been trained. During a Sadir period, when you aren't doing anything, or you are doing training, extra training, it's not Pikuach Nefesh at that time. It's a very broad definition of Pikuach Nefesh.
So that's the debate. We need a preventative Pikuach Nefesh. What does that mean? Right now, at this present moment, if it's peacetime, it's not Pikuach Nefesh, but it could cause a Pikuach Nefesh. If we don't have an army spread out, deployed north, south, east, west, then they're going to come to attack us. It's going to be very fertile ground and very enticing to our enemies to attack us. So we need a tzahal to be there all the time. So now
I'd like to add something.
It's not Pikuach Nefesh right now. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to add something that even during the Shirut, let's say Shirut Pa'il, when there's no war and soldiers are, say, guarding the borders or guarding an army base that people shouldn't come in and steal, that is considered halachically Pikuach Nefesh. You're allowed to do that on Shabbat. You're allowed to turn your radio on Shabbat. You're allowed to carry a gun on Shabbat to do that. That is.
If we're not there to defend the borders, then they're going to attack us. We must have an army even during peacetime as a deterrent. If we don't protect our borders, they're going to attack us. So you'll say, well, let somebody else do the job. But you can't say let somebody else do the job when it's a responsibility that is incumbent on the entire tzibur.
If I can just, I think he's also saying though,
Who's speaking?
This is Adam. I'm having issue with my camera. I can't turn the camera
Oh,
right this
Adam.
second. Yes. When he talks
Adam
about the
from
Basil,
Tamar?
Adam from Alon Shvut.
Oh, Adam. Okay, now I got it. I thought it was Adam from Tamar. Okay. Go ahead, Adam.
So
Sorry.
what he's saying is, that distribution of time and effort and the possibility of danger, he's talking about you can ask other people to also, he's not talking about like danger, like pikuach nefesh ta'ami, so he's talking about military service also includes danger, even in regular times, and even on there's all kinds of tasukah, miftzait, and things like that people do. And it's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to learn Torah, and I know you're going to clean the streets of Yerushalayim because Yerushalayim needs to be clean, but it's also important to learn Torah. But so for other things, yes, you can maybe say, afshar de acherim. But to when that service also includes some kind of danger, then to say to other people, I'm going to learn Torah, and you're going to have to take on more danger that I would have, instead of me taking on the danger, that's already a different question.
Great. Okay. But now, starting with the bottom of page 204 and moving forward, Rav Lichtenstein presents what I call the dialectic that I referred to before. He says the following: the choice of Hesder as an option for a yeshiva high school graduate is the most difficult of all options. This is Rav Lichtenstein's breakthrough ideology of Hesder. The most difficult of all options. What do you mean the most difficult of all options? Just the opposite. It's the easiest of all options. I do some Torah learning, do a little army service. I have this Hesder. I don't feel guilty. My conscience is calm. He says the following: the difficulty is not incidental. Incidental means what we call chitzoni, or secondary, but rather it is grounded in the very nature of Hesder. Or if I can use another word, in the very essence of Hesder. So the experience of Hesder as what we call a phenomenological concept is fraught with difficulty. It's, in a sense, he calls it a dual commitment. And he says the following: we say, Mishnah Novos, im ein kemach ein Torah, which clearly means that my fight, my efforts, hours upon hours, day by day, to bring home a loaf of bread and support my family is only a means to an end. The end is Torah. But im ein kemach ein Torah. There's no inherent tension between kemach and Torah. True, while I'm involved in kemach, it's very hard for me to think about Torah, but that's fine. I integrate kemach and Torah. But he says that integrating Torah and army service is a horse of a different color. He says the following: the division of time, energies, and attention inherent in the fusion of study of Torah with other enterprises, that's true with regard to army as well. It's just another application of the general rule of how to divide up your time and give due time to each of the different, the Torah and the Derech Eretz. He calls it a vocation, academic, other enterprises. So from this perspective, Hesder meshes with a broader problem of the relationship between Torah and Derech Eretz. However, he says on page 205, with reference to Hesder, there's a different kind of problem. He calls it a conflict of values, a conflict of lifestyle, a conflict of sensibility between the Beis Medrash and the boot camp. And he quotes the Ramban extensively in the Parsha Milchama, that the Ramban describes the Machne Milchama in very negative terms. The moral and religious sensitivity that is imbued in the nefesh of a Torah student in the Beis HaMedrash is, in a sense, the exact opposite of the dehumanizing and despiritualizing existence in the boot camp, as he calls it, meaning the Machne Tzava. And the Ramban describes it. The Ramban speaks about it in terms of abominations, that during war, people eat every abomination, they rob and they plunder. They're not ashamed of, or I don't want to say it out loud. And of course, the Ramban goes on to explain the heter of Eishes Yifas Torah. He says the following, that the situation that the Ramban is describing as the Machne Tzava is one of corruption and spiritual corrosion. Corruption and corrosion. He says the maintenance of a tenuous moral and ideological balance between these two components, it's almost an issue of the conflict of loves. So again, a conflict of labors, we know, that's Torah and Derech Eretz. But a conflict of loves, on one level, I love the Torah. And my love for Torah is all-encompassing. It's a burning, overriding love for Torah. But at the same time, as a religious Zionist, or more than that, as a person who believes that we have to defend our nation, that's another love. And he says that, in a sense, the love to defend our country is meant to bring us to be ready to fight to die. That's how intense our love is. So we talk about the love for Torah, for Hashem, for his mitzvos, situations that we discussed in Perek Ben Sorah Morer of Yehorik Val Yavar, you remember, a readiness to die, Shema Yisrael, Hashem. And at the same time, to be ready to fight even to death in a spiritually corrupt atmosphere of the boot camp. And if you take a look on page 206, he develops this, again, I can't help use that word, thesis and antithesis. He says that a yeshivat Hesder seeks to instill a love for Torah that is so profound. This is Rav Lichtenstein talking about his yeshiva on the highest level. So pervasive to render detachment from Torah as something painful. It's not just like, okay, I do my 9-to-5 job, then I put in 2 hours of learning at night, halavai, you know what I mean? No, it's not just like a schedule kind of thing. But it's protracted detachment from Torah. Because let's be honest, how much Torah learning? I mean, I was a Ram in Hesder yeshivas, right? I taught in Maleh Adumim, I taught in Shalavim. We used to go out to all the Ram to visit the guys in the army. So we gave them a shir. So once every 2-3 weeks, they got a shir. Again, a lot of it depending where they were, and many, many different factors that kick in. But you can't tell me that you're attached to learning in that period of time when you're serving in Tzahal. So it's a profound experience of detachment from that which you love. And yet, our dedication to the nation requires some sort of a cost that we have to pay to abruptly freeze our spiritual development. to put everything on hold, to be dedicated to a love for our people, our nation, our land, that is, in a certain sense, pulling us away from our love for the Torah on two levels. On the level of the spiritual clash between the two atmospheres of the Beis Medrash and the army, and at the level of total detachment from Torah.
So, sorry, isn't there a further point that I don't know if he addresses it? There's a regression when you're building upon something. You're in Shana Aleph, you start a Shana base or whatever, and then suddenly you go, and when you detach yourself, don't you lose out on the cumulative effects of constant learning? I mean, I don't know if he addresses that, but that's probably Hesder Merkaz's problem with Hesder, is that in the middle of this growth process, you not only the detachment, it's not a hold, it's not like putting pause, it's actually, there could be some kind of, I don't know, if
Antinomy, he calls it. It's a fancy word from philosophy.
but I'm saying there's also
There's something in a sense antithetical to army service.
it's not only antithetical, it's also regressive. Because
so here you built up, you developed your spirituality, you got closer and closer to Hashem through your avodah of Torah and Tefillah, and now you're in a very, very different kind of an atmosphere. Very different. I mean, that's understating it.
yeah, but besides that, it also causes you not to forget, but to, I don't know. I'm talking about more regressive than just detachment.
Correct. I mean, again, on one level it's detachment, on another level it's antithetical. It's a regression.
Right,
it's really
right.
a regression. He says from the yeshiva's perspective, these antitheses are fully justified. But yet they constitute the very essence of Hesder. This is not Hesder as an arrangement, as a pragmatic solution to a tug of war. This is the essence of Hesder as a complex and sensitive balance, to find a balance. And I think what Rav Lichtenstein is probably trying to project is that the Hesder enterprise is relatively new. What do I mean by new? We are constantly learning. The Rosh Yeshiva, the Mechanchim, are learning how to deal with these issues. I mean, I'll just tell you a story about one of my students in Shalavim. He told me, after they decided, it was sort of like a decision on the part of the Hesder movement after the war in Lebanon. I had a friend of mine who was a Rebbe in Kiryat Shmona. He had 25 boys in his class. 8 boys did not come back alive. I mean, it's just devastating. So they decided, which I don't understand the statistics of it. You guys are greater statisticians than I am. But they decided to spread the Hesdernikim around to different parts of the army. I guess it was so devastating, especially the Yom Kippur War and the war in Lebanon. That was the decision anyway. So practically speaking, I'm talking about a Talmud who was the only Beidish, as we call him, the only yeshiva bacher in the entire group, the entire pluga. And he told me that you can't even describe what goes on Friday night. And the social pressure, because he's the only guy in the pluga who doesn't show up on the party on Friday night. He said it's incredible. I tried to give him chizuk, but honestly, I don't know what I would be able to do in his situation. And I'm not going to describe what goes on at these parties. However, he says preserving a balance with its multiple subtle nuances entails traversing a narrow bridge. He sounds like Gesher Tzar Me'od, from Rab Nachman. There's a narrow bridge here. And herein lies the primary difficulty. It's existential and not just practical. And he says that many only achieve the balance imperfectly. However, those who do succeed in attaining the balance, who despite the difficulties are at peace with themselves, that's Hesder at its finest. So again, what Rav Lichtenstein is doing here, he's not willing to sweep everything under the carpet. He's not willing to sell us a bowl of cherries and tell us that Hesder is an easy kind of compromise. The opposite is true. The greatness of Hesder lies in the challenge of its inherent, essential, what he calls existential difficulty. And he says, who can succeed in maintaining the balance? To have both the love for Torah in a very intense, profound way, to continue on spiritual advancement and development, and at the same time, the love for the state of Israel, the love for the people of Israel, the love for the greatest chesed that's feasible to save Jewish lives, is a burning desire in his heart and his soul. These problems are very real. They pose a formidable educational challenge, and we shouldn't ignore it. He says the adherents of Hesder, those of us who grapple with the very complex demands of Hesder on a regular basis, we are absolutely keenly aware of the problems. And then he goes on to tell us, which I thought was mind-boggling, that Hesder is not new. It goes back to the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, to Yoshua, to David HaMelech, to Rabbi Akiva. As Chazal described them, they were all basically yeshivot Hesder. They integrated Torah study with defending the country, going out to battle. Again, in the balance of this article, which starts on page 207, he's going to present the arguments against yeshiva students going to the army. And he's going to reject every one of those arguments. Like you remember last week, we discussed the Medrash about the Gemara in Nedarim about Avram Avinu and why his sons were punished with Golus. And one of the answers in the Gemara was because Avram Avinu conscripted his Talmid, his students, into the army. So Rav Lichtenstein is going to make mincemeat out of this. And when Rav Lichtenstein quotes the Medrash about the Asar Rugi Malchus, the Sugya Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Zayin, about how Rav Chanina ben Tradion says to Rabbi Lazar, you're going to survive. I am not, because I dedicated myself exclusively to the study of Torah, whereas you dedicated yourself to both Torah and Chesed. And therefore Hashem will spare you. And all this to show that the obligation to go out and defend the Jewish people is a supreme obligation which overrides Torah study. And he says the following: even if you have no concern for the state of Israel, it's very difficult to say these words in our time. He says, even if you entertain the naive notion, which one Rosh Yeshiva expressed at a meeting, that business would continue, meaning the Torah Yeshiva's learning would continue, as usual, with Palestinian flags fluttering from the rooftops. So Rav Lichtenstein in 1981 has to argue against this. You know, today, no one could say such a thing. It's not even Olal Adas. He says, the matters in which the honest men of Torah, he says, an aspiring Talmid Chacham, Hesder, he says, is legitimate. And in my mind, it's even more legitimate than the other option of Torah study. And here I want to make a diuk in Rav Lichtenstein. And tell me if you agree with me. I wish he was available for question. Not every yeshiva student is combat material. You know, in the army, they call those who are not combat material, they call them jobniks. Have you ever heard that phrase? Rav Lichtenstein presents the alternative of Hesder in the light of the absolute chova of Hatzolas Nefashos. And he extends this and applies this even to the defensive peacetime situation. But can I honestly say that I'm involved in Pikuach Nefesh and Hatzolas Nefashos if I'm not combat material? And I'm wondering if maybe we could suggest that, according to Rav Lichtenstein, there could be a very short period of basic training so that in event of a war, even someone who's not combat material can pick up a gun and defend himself and defend others. But that's it. Send him back to the yeshiva. Because the essence of the chova here in Rav Lichtenstein's presentation is that the greatest chesed that you can do is defending the Jewish people. So I understand Bishlema that applies to someone who will be out there defending Israel. But if somebody is going to be in an office, I mean, then you could ask the question about the Rabbanut. You know, we need rabbis in the army. We need kashrus in the army. We need, again, whatever level of observing the Shabbos in the army, and so forth and so on. And I don't know, you know, Rav Lichtenstein at one point in the article, maybe I can find it for you, but if not, you'll find it on your own. I think it's here on page 210. He writes that the Rambam at the end of Shemitah V'Yovel, which we covered last week, that any Jew who wants to dedicate himself Lamo to L'Sharis Hashem, Harei Zeh Miskadish Kodesh Kedoshim, he can join Shevet Levi, so to speak. And we take off of his shoulders all of the all of this world. So Rav Lichtenstein, let me just see. Again, I don't want to spend too much time looking for it, but maybe it'll pop up here on page 210. Maybe it's 211. Let me just, again, anyway, he has a whole presentation here in which he claims that the percentage of people that could fit that category of the Ram at the end of Shemitah V'Yovel is close to nil. It's like, maybe it's a percentage point. I don't know. He doesn't pin it down, but he said, rare is the person who could be described as the Rambam described this person as Kodesh Kadoshim, because he's totally focused on his Torah learning. But Rav Lichtenstein does admit that we need such a person to remain in the Beis Medrash and become a future Mora Hora B'Yisrael. Yeah, I was reminded of the sugya that we mentioned in Sanhedrin about, not being poda the Shavui B'Yisrael K'dei Demeim, except for a person who's going to be the next Mora Hora B'Yisrael. You remember that? So I know that time is limited here. We're almost at the end, but let's take a quick look on page 211, which is towards the end of the essay. And he says that the Gemara in Durham that we mentioned about Avram Avinu used the word angaria. Angaria, he says, is forced labor. And he says that that argument, based on the Gemara in Durham, can only lead us to the conclusion that a coercive draft, which is called angaria, is prohibited. But again, he says that that's not our issue. Our issue is not whether to coerce army or not. Our issue is how do we make our decision? Each graduate of yeshiva high school has to make his decision. Not coercive. It's a question of halacha. He says the following. The postulate that every Levi enjoys a dispensation from army duty has no source in Chazal. When Chazal say about a Levi, they're talking about financial support. Does it say anywhere that in a case of danger, a Levite is exempt from battle? On the contrary, the Gemara says in Masechta Sota that afilu kala michupasa. He says that a Ben Torah who signs up as a Levi, should we say that he's exempt from lulav or shofar? Is fighting the battle and defending the country less important than lulav and shofar? Are we saying that somebody who signs up as a Ben Levi is given a categorical dispensation from all the mitzvahs in the Torah? Surely not. Okay, Rabos, again, it's a long article. I think we got up to page 212. I don't think that necessarily we would spend another shear on this, even though there are another 5 pages in the article, but we covered the first 18 pages of the article. Again, I tried the best I could. You'll give me the grade, either good or bad, to highlight the points of Rav Lichtenstein, because honestly, for me, I went through this essay twice. Each time it took me hours. So I tried to save you that to some extent. But obviously, Rav Lichtenstein is a great advocate for the Hesder ideology, but the chiddush here is that he's not trying to tell us that it's just an easy way out. That's the best compromise of all the other options. That's not what it's about. This essay, in a very honest and, he puts it forward method of showing us the difficulty and the challenge that makes Hesder the most difficult and complex of all the possibilities, but yet with the potential of something glorious. Okay, then, Rabosai. So we'll stop here. And
Yes, Shakar.
I heard they got a big one. Baruch Hashem. Yamach Shemo, they got a big one.
Thank God, yeah. And
I'm always
Claudine
looking.
Gay just resigned from Harvard.
Yeah.
Who resigned?
The
president of Harvard.
President of Harvard. The anti-Semitic.
Oh, that's what you meant. Oh, I had something else in mind.
No.
Oh, that too.
The Hamas,
Those are the two big
Hamas
news
guy was
tonight.
assassinated, and
Oh.
Claudine Gay, the anti-Semitic black girl from Harvard.
Okay, Rabosai, I can't figure out what's going on. It's very confusing to me.
Right.
Okay, then. Thank you so much.